All right, so welcome everybody. I'm Richard Sassoon, and my co-host is Aaron de los Reyes. It's actually his series. We're going to talk about the European Union, and we're going to split this into four general parts. The first part, which is today, is we're going to go through the history of the European Union. The next part is that we'll detail the institutions of the European Union. The third part is that we'll talk about the legal construction. How does the European Union work in terms of its legal implementation in the member states? And the fourth is that we're going to talk about the political crises that have resulted from the mixing between the European Union and its institutions with the events that have been taking place in Europe and the nationalistic desires of different European groups. So without further ado, let's sort of understand a little bit about what Europe is, because in sort of a big sense, Europe is made of a number of different international and supranational organizations that are designed to facilitate the creation of European harmony in a variety of different spheres, right? So if you look at this map, it looks, look at this figure, it looks a little daunting, but it's basically showing the vast variety that we have in Europe. So the first thing to notice is that the European Union includes a number of countries that are from different regions of Europe, but also excludes a number of European countries, right? You follow that blue box, there's a lot of countries in Europe that are represented here that are not in that blue box. And there are reasons for that. There are also reasons why, for example, you have countries like Ireland and Cyprus that are in the Eurozone, but are not in the Schengen area, and ones that are in the EFTA, which is a European Free Trade Association. But because of that, they're not in the EU. And so we're going to see some of those institutions, how they develop, and why it is that there are these non-overlapping, these overlapping groups that are not fully unified because of the way that the European Union was constructed as a piecemeal federative treaty-based entity, and not as a single unitary moment, like, for example, when the US Constitution was created in 1789. So to sort of break it down a little bit more in terms of a way that's a little bit more visual, I wanted to create this map which shows all of the different ways that the European organizations and groups have come together, right? So you've got the ones that are in brown, and those are ones that are part of all three of the major European Union groups, right? They're part of Schengen, they're part of the European Union, and they're part of the Eurozone. But you can see that there are, and I did this in sort of a primary colors make secondary colors sort of scenario, where you can see that there are some that are in the European Union, but not in Schengen or using the euro. There are some that are using the euro, but not in Schengen. And you can see that there is this incredible variety based on how they joined, under what conditions they joined. And of course, Britain is uninvolved because it left, the other ones uninvolved because they've never been asked. And they've never proposed to join the European Union. But when we get to those particular institutions, what Schengen is, what European Union is, what the Eurozone is, then we'll talk more in depth about why different groups fall into different ones of these paths. So one of the things is that the European Union did not always have the same membership as it does now. And so you can see over the trajectory of the history, there are nations that entered and at different points in time. The only nation, of course, that left is the United Kingdom. But the general process of the European Union has been expansion, and that is something that is a politically contentious topic. Although from a treaty perspective, it's not as contentious, right? It's sort of understood in the treaty that the European Union will expand, and in the treaties, the European Union will expand. But the reasons why it expanded or not change over time. Okay, and also we're going to talk about all these underlying organizations, but I wanted to give a sense of how many different organizations sort of fed into the European Union. And so you're going to see some of that complexity today when we talk about the foundations of those organizations and their historical moments. So this is the history, right? Aaron, take it away.
All right, great. And then let me pull this down here, and then you'll just switch slides, right? So,
Mhm.
and do admission. So, I think we all know what the Roman Empire was, and the sort of very basic rubric of European history, where you've had this, very large turnover of either large nation states or the creation of nation states even before that, or large groups of peoples like the Franks, or various eventually hundreds, really almost 1,000 sub or micro units of governance under the Holy Roman Empire. And so I'm not going to do a big, broad sweep of European history, but I do believe the Roman Empire represents at least a a vision for what European continental both power and unification is. So I just sort of put that there as sort of a starting point. And Richard, do you mind going into the next slide? And please, if you have questions as we go through. Um, so the concepts of United States of Europe, they really even go further back than 1728, actually, to William Penn, who was a colonist in the United States, actually made very famous in Philadelphia. The University of Pennsylvania is named after him. The William Penn Tower in Philadelphia, et cetera. But so there was, what I would almost call sort of philosophical or sort of theoretical exercises by philosophers in Europe and in what eventually became the United States, but were colonies, European colonies, which really, basically conceived of the concept of somehow diffusing power, ultimately to develop a post European Civil War form of governance, because obviously in the 15 and 1600s, the war, especially in the 1600s in Europe and in England, were just incredibly destructive. The estimates are somewhere between 5% and 10% of the population, at least, was killed by them, and in some cases, in some areas, it was as high as 25%. So there was really this a revulsion to that, and through the 1700s, and these are not sort of minor figures, but Marquis de Lafayette and Kosciuszko and Kant. I mean, you're looking at some of the great thinkers of the 1700s, conceived of some form of unified or eternal peace or Congress of Europe. And then in the 1800s, as the development of governance expanded, the mechanisms of it, the development of stronger legislatures were developed in nation states. Those thinkers, or obviously new generations of those thinkers, kept wanting to develop sort of a pan-European a belief of governance. And the first the first president of the Greek Republic, I demolish his name all the time, Richard. So
Ioannis Kapodoustrias.
yes, you're awesome. So you could make a very objective argument, was one of the uh, big thinkers in development of egalitarian education for all, not just for elites, or not just trying to develop a group of elites that could administer, but wanting to have a much more unified and diffusive education, or concept of education, and also stress sort of a pan-Europeanism to that, and wanted that really across Europe. I don't know, Richard, do you see Katie wants to get in? Okay, cool. And so through the 18th century, and then obviously as socialism and as sort of global socialism and communism also took off, in the late 1800s, middle to late 1800s, and into the 20th century. There was basically a let's call it a communist or a socialist version of the same desire, to the point that Leon Trotsky wanted a Soviet United States of Europe, which is sort of funny when you think about that, because it would be a Russian version of that, which is very, nationalistic. But and then in World War II, very famous Italian, political philosophers, Spinelli and Rossi, who also became politicians after World War II, came up with this manifesto, the Vinotin manifesto, which was really wanting to instill the last 100, 200 years of thinking into a post-World War II belief in creating a free and united Europe. Next slide, Richard.
One of the things that I want to point out is that you can see actually all of the different parts of Europe represented here, right? We have French thinkers, we have German thinkers, we have Greek thinkers, we have Polish thinkers, we have Italian thinkers, and we have Russian thinkers. So it's not as if this is some sort of British imposition or French imposition on the rest of Europe. This is an idea that has been inculcated by a large number of Europeans coming from different parts of the continent.
Yep, exactly. So as we've talked about the age of enlightenment and all the development of democratic ideals and basic rights of people, French Revolution, the American Revolution, the revolutions of 1848, and then the sort of smaller ones that aren't talked about as much, they all collided with the development of national states and nationalism at the same time. So the nationalism and the national states drove more protectionism, border control, national identity, and the belief that controlling trade as a unit of power actually gave you more wealth, even though there was economic thinkers like David Ricardo and others that had already sort of proven that the idea of comparative advantage existed in economics. But then you also had these great thinkers and these political philosophers trying to influence this development of sort of pan-Europeanism, which really became an elite concept and something elites could live with. They had the ability to sort of travel across Europe when there wasn't wars. Next slide real quick. Sure, thanks. So, there's someone who doesn't get really a lot of attention, but is a fantastic person to sort of dig into is Giuseppe Mazzini, who really called for the Federation of European Republics. It was an extremely modern concept, in the 1840s. And then obviously Victor Hugo, really launched into United States of Europe. He wrote some pamphlets. He wanted to develop this sort of, almost intellectual concept of European brotherhood. So that you'd see this world of the United States of America, United States of Europe, et cetera. Next slide. As we can see, there's just a lot of philosophers and then eventually anarchists and socialists that really sort of conflated the idea of either controlled or centralized power and the development of pan-Europeanism, or very diffuse and sort of pure independent, almost mix of anarchy, libertarianism, because the goal was basically to get rid of civil war. I mean, fundamentally, there was a newer, more modern belief that either you can impose a new political social order, or you could drain basically the existence of the nationalism and and you'll be able to get rid of, perpetual war, which at that point was, almost half a millennium.
Now, Aaron, out of curiosity,
Mhm.
how do people like Bakunin reconcile their views of anarchy and lack of government with the idea of creating this larger, more powerful governmental entity over all of Europe?
So get ready to laugh because you always do it on tune. They don't. So they like all good anarchists. They don't do that. What I would say is most philosophical anarchists are in principle not trying to be extremely consistent. What they're trying to do is postulate ideas of the possibility. And to be sort of fair, that was really the idealism, right? And the thing we have to look at is that this 1867 wasn't just a date in the middle of towards the end of a decade. The 1860s is arguably one of the more important periods in the 19th century, because obviously you had the American Civil War, you had the changing of the serfdom laws in Russia, you obviously had
the Hungarians finally
Hungarians.
getting quasi-independence in the dual
That's right.
monarchy.
That's exactly right. You had, one of many, let's say, Chinese identity-driven civil wars going on. So there was a lot of fostering of liberty and sort of, ultimately self-actualization. And so there was a, almost like a hope springs eternal belief that all of that, that sort of striving for the beauty of people's power mixed together with a sort of pacifism could somehow achieve some greater state. And I would argue a lot of anarchists basically philosophically drove themselves there because the existing institutions that they would have supported, they just couldn't see the path towards freedom, liberty, suffrage, etc. And not all of them, but I do think that was something. And you see a version of that, I think, today as people, swing to more extremes, is that they don't they don't feel they're gaining this the power of the self, out of the existing political institutions.
Now, Aaron, we have a question in the comments, and it's asking, according to this, Woodrow Wilson's idea of the League of Nations, was that not an original idea? And I'd like to answer first, and then of course I'll give a lot more color. My view is that the League of Nations was unique in the sense that it would incorporate all of the nations around the world, that there would be this international entity that would really be able to resolve conflicts through the process of diplomatic negotiation between multiple different parties. The idea of the United States of Europe was something much more in terms of a governmental structure that would be over all of Europe. So it wouldn't be a place of dialogue being facilitated between European states, but that the European states would themselves be in part of a larger functional union, either national or supranational. So we're talking about two different things.
Yep. No, exactly. All right. Next slide. Real quick here. So obviously the great powers, the pre-World War II or World War I, I should say, and it's only World War I because we look backwards on it. They viewed it as the Great War. They didn't know there'd be a second one, and say we're doing number. It wasn't Star Wars, and so the great powers clearly. Had a radically different view that had been built into their societies about how much of a unified Europe was even possible. And we have to, I think it's important not to forget this sort of evolution into, literally evolution into science, and into, what you'd call pseudoscience of the late 19th century and into the 20th century, where people started to truly believe in this idea of sort of essentialism around, people, around, the differences, that they weren't as much of a cultural construct or social political led sort of developments, but that people in Greece were really, different. Like there was a specialness to the Greekness or to the Germanic, et cetera. And that, of course, fed, we all know, all that nationalism that exploded through World War I and World War II. But it also really broke down much of this belief. Really, anyone who sort of postulated this in the early 20th century was sort of viewed as extremely naive, almost the way people would look at, when people go to uni or college, they have these sort of large aspirational beliefs. It lost most of its favor. Obviously, let's go to the next slide real quick. World War II was so astronomically destructive that an enormous amount of people, not just sort of wild-eyed philosophical people, but people of the remaining populations that were alive, that had political power, truly recognized the uniqueness in the modern industrial war making, and just basically reached the point that after 500-600 years of this, that it was absolutely unsustainable to imagine, especially in the nuclear age, a Europe of, and it sounds kind of silly today, but the idea of a bunch of European states having nuclear weapons really concentrated the mind. And at the same time, the costs of the war and the post-war period, because obviously the U.S. and the Soviet Union collided immediately, and the Western powers that were weakened, the English and the French, that basically they needed support, which the Marshall Plan really provided that. And it wasn't just financial support, it was institutional support. It really arguably it filled the vacuum, the void, for either more extreme nationalism or for the shift to sort of Soviet communism. And at the same time, allowed the space for the political leadership to start to develop itself, especially in the late 40s, mid-late 40s, from 46 to 49. Just, I think, a really critical era that doesn't really get discussed ever. We just sort of jump right into, of course, Europe was going to happen.
Yeah, Aaron, could you unpack that a little bit? Because today, looking at Europe, the idea of France going to war with Germany or with Spain or with Italy or with Britain, as much as French and British people turn their noses up at each other, seems patently ludicrous. Why was there the thought that, especially after World War II was won and Europe was in such a difficult position where they would need the Marshall Plan, was there this idea that Europe could once again become the site of multiple battles? Why was that the thought?
So there was you could argue it came from really two sides. It came from clearly how strong the Soviet, what eventually turned into what Churchill said, the Iron Curtain, how fast, how hard that came down. And on the Western side, the incredible power that the United States had at that point. So that's one side of it, is that, when the Europeans understood now they were operating in this sort of new world order. And the second one, given the weak states that they were in, those populations were extremely fragile politically. And you saw it, especially as the Soviets, came into Southern Europe, into Greece and Italy, and started having huge influence in those elections, and attempted the same thing in France. That didn't pan out to the same way it did in Italy and Greece. But it was very, very disruptive. And so there were political leaders that said that, we could, in essence, just fragment, just atomically, fragment completely, which was, one of the many plans that the Soviets had. which was if they could not gain control over a state, then breaking it down through its own natural sort of regional nationalism, it would be another objective. So in essence, sort of a nationalist communism.
One
So
thing I'd like to add, because I saw one or two comments about it, is that people are a little confused on the difference between international and supranational.
Mhm.
So, and that's really important for us to flesh out. An international organization is an organization that works at bringing countries together, either for dialogue or for shared interests. And the way that it influences the countries that are a part of it are through resolutions and treaties. But those resolutions and treaties aren't implemented at the national level until those governments implement them themselves,
Yeah.
right? If there's a Security Council resolution from the United Nations, which is an international organization, that doesn't suddenly make whatever that security resolution says happen on the ground. It doesn't compel the countries to which it is addressed to do those things. A supranational organization is much better understood within the context of within a nation state, but just bigger than that.
Yeah.
So in the United States, for example, we have the states, and the states are responsible to the federal government. When the federal government in the United States imposes a law on the various states of the United States, that becomes a law without any action of the state legislatures, right? It is the law of the country. They don't need to approve it. It's not a treaty. It's not anything like that. And so when we talk about the European Union or the United States of Europe being supranational, we're talking about some kind of governmental entity that actually has power over the European states and is not just a place of dialogue.
And we'll get into the details of how the European Union legal mechanisms have sort of evolved to try to weave their way in that supranationalism or model, basically, so that you could have both the national power of the nation state, but also have the larger, what's called a directive, especially in a non-constitutional environment. So we'll get into all that as we get going. Next slide real quick here. And I'll crank through some of these so we can kind of get to the real action here. Can you actually just click it, I think, one more time? Yeah. So understanding that Western European, and when we say Europe, that's what we really mean. We mean Western Europe. So everything west of West Berlin, basically, and or south. Okay, I guess that's Zach. And so the Marshall Plan and then ultimately the Truman Doctrine, which became the containment policy, right? The goal was to contain the Soviet Union relative vis-a-vis to Western Europe, because there was I think a fairly realistic view that the Soviets not being able to sort of militarily invade Western Europe without having to confront the United States, were going to attempt to politically influence and have a very strong influence in Western Europe. So the goal was the US was to create the space to allow Western Europeans to further integrate across their own countries. And obviously the French and the Germans were really at the top of the list, but what became, the Benelux and then eventually other states. So next slide real quick. Thanks. Financially, by today's dollars, a dollar packed quite a bit relative to that period. We have to understand how completely destroyed Europe was, and in this case, Western Europe. I mean, you had a famine in 44 and 45 in the Netherlands, which, estimates are, 40,000 people, starved to death. You had a incredibly demolished a countryside, and there was a substantial fear of widespread famine. So those, 12, $13 billion went very far. I mean, by today's standards, if you kind of threw purchasing power and you threw sort of a cost of value index to it, I mean, it really would be hundreds of billions of dollars in terms of how it impacted life on the ground. And there was also obviously a huge amount of resources that were left after the war by the United States in Europe, vehicles, equipment, engineering, et cetera. There was a whole suite. So OEEC is one. There's going to be this sort of lettuce bowl of names. Don't try to remember them. You can listen later or look on Wikipedia. I'll put a few links in. I mean, over the last 75 years, 74 years, whatever, there has been, hundreds of these sort of, little committees, councils, groups that have gotten together. So one was the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which lasted just, until the next one. If you don't mind going to the next slide.
I think a number of these organizations were intentionally confusingly named so that way they could bother people who would try to learn about them.
That's exactly right. And trust me. So I'm not going to go through the Marshall Plan here because that doesn't really, you can see that. Let's see. Why don't we keep going? So the history of EU formulation here. So these are 5 names. There's really it's considered the founding fathers 11, which I will put there's a great little snippet of a YouTube video that for about 3-4 minutes that talks about each of the 11 of them, and you could really make an argument. It's part of how I really wanted to push into this. Is that these were, very similar, I mean, relative to time, obviously, to, historical founders that conceived of a new way to live, a new order. And they might not have had the sort of philosophical backgrounds in sort of imagining the concept of suffrage and liberty the way French and English and American philosophers and Germans and many others around the world had in the 1700s and the 18th century and 19th century. But in terms of actionable power, they were immensely powerful. And maybe if we go into, when we go into the politics in a future episode, we'll dive into those 11. Next slide, real quick here. Council of Europe. Do you want to pivot back to you, or what do you want to do here, Richard?
Yeah,Ll take this. Okay, so one of the interesting things is that, right, we've talked about how this concept of the United States of Europe existed in all different European countries and with slightly different contexts underlying this idea that there should be a united Europe. And so we see one of these ideas being put forward by Winston Churchill, and he goes to Zurich, Switzerland on 19th September 1946, and he gives this speech that's often called the United States of Europe speech, in which he desires a closer economic and social integration of Europe. This is one of those instances where he's not looking for a supranational entity, or at least doesn't seem to. He seems to be looking for an international entity that would look over Europe. And so starting from 1946, there begins to be a slow evolution towards the creation of the Council of Europe in 1949. Now, the Council of Europe is entirely separate from the European Union, but one of the things that we notice immediately is that it has the same blue flag with the same 12 stars, right, to represent the union of all of Europe. And then there's that C there for council. The functioning languages of the council were English because of the United Kingdom being a founding member, and French because it was supposed to show that French was the diplomatic language bringing Europe together. The point of the Council of Europe was to discuss and come to consensus on basic European policies. And accordingly, you can see that the membership of the Council of Europe, as it grew, has included nearly every country in Europe except for three. It doesn't include the Vatican. It doesn't include Kosovo, and it doesn't include Belarus. The Vatican, because of its size; Kosovo, because of its newness and issues with recognition; and Belarus, because of Lukashenko. But generally speaking, the Council of Europe has set up a number of different institutions. And the primary institution that it set up is the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, France, which is that glorious building with three cylinders. Now, the European Court of Human Rights has as its primary function the implementation of the first pan-European Convention on Human Rights, right? The European Convention of on Human Rights, which is applicable in all states that belong to the Council of Europe. And a violation of these rights can be brought up by citizens to the court. Any violation can be brought up to the court in order to reach a just and binding resolution on any of the treaty members. Now, the ability of the court to actually force an implementation is rather difficult, right? Because there's no executive arm. But at the same time, it creates a clear standard about which human rights belong to all European citizens. In some cases, for example, like the United Kingdom, there wasn't anything similar to a Bill of Human Rights that had existed in their countries. In the case of the United Kingdom, it was because it was tradition that certain things were rights, but there wasn't a clear codification. In other cases, there were codifications, but as an international entity by which these things were entered into by treaty, the European Convention on Human Rights also entered as a treaty and was accepted by many of these states. When they became part of the European Union mandated the acceptance of these in European Union member states. And so the real contribution here of the Council of Europe was this creation of a human rights legalistic entity that was able to unify all of Europe under a new rubric. And let's not forget how soon this is, right? The European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg was created less than 10 years after the end of the Holocaust, when one of the largest human rights violations in the history of Europe took place. So this was no small feat of legislative and historical change. On the flip side, when we moved to the continent, there was also a move by a number of French leaders to create an economic binding institution to hold all of Europe together, especially France and steel. And so you have French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman giving the Schuman Declaration on the 9th of May, 1950. And his declaration was that at a principle level, the method of war should be made impossible between France and Germany. And the methods of war were, of course, coal and steel, right? Steel to produce armaments, coal in order to power them. And so by internationalizing the resources of France and of Germany, they would be unable, these two states, to take exclusive ownership of those resources and therefore be able to declare war on one another. And so they created the European Coal and Steel Community. Now, the goal of the community, as I said, was to unify these resources, and they signed the Treaty of Paris on the 18th of April, 1951, doing this. But there were a number of other smaller European countries in terms of their economies that wanted to be a part of this union. And so we see the Benelux countries, like Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, joining in. We also see Italy joining in. And so these 6 countries become the initial founders of the European Coal and Steel Community. Of course, when we talk about Germany at this point, we're talking about West Germany because Germany was divided. And the European Coal and Steel Community did a number of different things. But there were so many arguments leading into the creation of this combined entity. So just to go through a few of them, right? We addressed the peace argument that without direct access to coal and steel, these two parties would not be able to go to war with each other. There's also the quote German argument, in the sense of after World War I, there had been an attempt to make Germany incapable of rearming militarily. And the way that they had done that was through the use of restricting access to the Saarland, which is the area in Western Germany where the majority of coal is produced. And the Nazis actually invaded the Saarland as one of their earlier actions in the 1930s in order to rearm themselves. But by internationalizing the access to these resources, the Germans couldn't rearm, couldn't access these resources without the other countries knowing about it and being able to do something about it. The next argument, of course, was economic, that if these countries were interdependent economically, it would lead to a growth in both of their economies as they would trade together. And finally, there's this legal argument, right? Because we're talking about the establishment of a superstate structure. At this point, the superstate structure would be very minimal, but it would create a system of laws and statutes that the European states could use to create a unified political system that went beyond the borders of their nation states, which is key, because this is the first time that this has really happened in Europe, even on this small scale, referring to only economic trade and development. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the European Coal and Steel Committee is that it actually has a very similar organizational footprint, far less developed, but similar organizational footprint to what we find in the European Union today. So we have this high authority, which is an executive committee, very similar to the European Commission of today. We have the Special Council of Ministers and the Common Assembly, which are two legislative bodies, the Council of Ministers being created by the European governments, appointing people to represent them, and the Common Assembly being somehow directly elected by the population, somehow indirectly elected. It's a little complicated. And their legislative function was significantly curtailed from the modern European Parliament, but the Council of Ministers and the Common Assembly match in a certain way the two legislative branches of the current European Union, being the Council of the European Union and the Parliament of the European Union. We also see a Court of Justice, which is a forerunner of the European Union's Court of Justice. The only difference is that here we have a consultative committee, which was a formalization of a more informal system of talking to individual stakeholders like employers, employees in the coal industry, and consumer organizations to get ideas as to what laws should be proposed. We have consultative bodies as well that do this function in the European Union today. They're just made up of different groups. So even in the 1950s, with a significantly pared down view of the superstate powers, we already have the beginnings of what would look like a European Union. So Aaron, you want to take this?
Sure. And there was one group, and this is a joke. This is a European joke. We'll try to throw a few in there. One of my favorite groups.
Sorry, one question. We have a question in the chat. How long is this program today? The Treaty of Paris was signed in 1951, and it had an expiration date of 50 years. So in 2002, the European Coal and Steel Community ceased to exist. But by that point, all of its functions had been integrated into the Europe. I don't know why the recording stopped.
I don't know either.
Okay. But all of those functions became integrated into the European Union under the Treaty of Maastricht in 1990. So for all intents and purposes, the European Coal and Steel Committee still exists in terms of its integration into the European Union, but in terms of a standalone entity, it is now defunct.
Exactly. And to answer Kay, I don't know who Kay is, but we'll hopefully be done, if that's the other part of your question, is around 6 Eastern today, so about another hour and 15 minutes. I was going to crack a joke, which in 1975 we'll eventually get to it, but one of my favorite groups or institutions, the European Court of Auditors. It's just such a funky. It's like number 17 maybe, or 14 or whatever. So building on top of the ECSC is the idea. And when we say common market in 2020, this is not the same definition that people believed in the late 40s and the early 50s, because the development, the economic development that existed then coming out of World War II was just very different. You still had a world of more raw materials. You would probably, it would be a very fair sort of view if you understand how sort of China was developing in the 80s and in the 90s. Europe was very similar to that, where you had very large, basically semi-state-owned enterprises, very large industrial concerns, very small sort of local market participants, kind of the town and city village type sellers. And so the idea of a common market was really around common goods. Think of them as traded goods. So things that would be like natural resources, components of shipping and sort of transshipping, but at a very limited level. There wasn't this sort of let's call it complete philosophical understanding of what free trade would be and how you could synthesize that, and more importantly, how you could pay for it.
If I could add also, there were also a number of specific industries that were national industries of the various countries. Like, for example, France wanted to protect their agriculture. And so these kinds of special industries were excluded from the common market, were excluded from the anti-tariff policies that the ECSC was beginning to implement.
And even to this day, I mean, so one thing most people, nerds about the EU still don't fully appreciate is that when you look at whatever, and we'll get to how the EU or how these structures even had financial wherewithal and budgets, but when they did have these budgets, the common agricultural policy, the CAP, was really the driver. I mean, you would say basically 4 to 5 Deutschmarks, francs, et cetera, pre-euro currency units were basically agricultural supports, directly or indirectly. And even to this day, it's still 40% of the budget is directly or indirectly. That, it looks like that in the next 7 years, given they have the new 7-year budget, starting at the end of last year. That number is maybe going to be about 30%, but it's still very large. So the agricultural policy supports are just extremely fundamental to the development of Europe in the last 70 years, and I would argue really for the next 30 years, especially as they move down a more ecological, sustainable development, climate change based set of policies. And to be honest, people just don't talk about that because I think I think fundamentally they're afraid to. I think they understand that you're not going to move farmers down a policy train very fast. And so there tends to be just pushing a lot of the agricultural discussion to the side. But the protection of French farmers were very fundamental and necessary because they were the breadbasket feeding basically the Soviet embargoed at-risk Europe, whether it was the Netherlands, whether it was West Germany, even Belgium, and obviously parts of Southern Europe that needed access to food stocks. So that really sort of got baked into the structure, and I would argue to this day, it's sort of the same way as in the United States, we'll define Social Security as sort of a third rail in politics, third rail on a train, you get electrocuted. I would argue agricultural policy is the third rail in European, not just national, but transnational politics. And I would say keep that one on the side. And if you're interested, as we go through the series, you do your own research, or just to kind of pique your interest and to see how sort of commingled that agricultural policy is. And ultimately, I think in the next 20, 30 years, it's going to be incredibly difficult to advance what the EU says it wants to advance, unless it does some significant agricultural policy reform. It just won't have the dollars. Or the euros, I should say. But so anyways, we talked so far about,
wait, Aaron, if I can add before, because we have a question in the comments. Do we see any similarities between our country's Trump movement and Europe's run at populism? There are certainly similarities. I think we're going to address that more in the fourth session, where we talk about the political implications of the European Union. But my personal view is that aside from it being a populist revolt, I don't really see that much similarity in terms of the underlying motivations for why it was happening. Just in a one line, the Trump populist movement was that the middle of our country felt like they were being ignored by the coastal elites in the country, and so they quote took back their country. And if you look at Brexit, for example, the underlying argument was that there was a lack of democracy and a lack of monetary spending within Britain that could have been spent in Britain. Whether or not those arguments are valid is something, of course, that we're going to discuss much more in that fourth session. But you can see that those arguments are very different arguments. One is a culture clash argument, and one is a financial redistribution argument.
And I would argue that, one thing that's very different in the United States than in Europe, or when we say the word Europe, which, is great when we have these presentations, but when you live life in the Pyrenees, Europe is, the continental Europe. What does that mean? Right. I mean, it's Western Eurasia, really, is that there is a lot less mobility in populations over time in Europe. People don't, I'm not saying elites, and I'm not saying extremely smart young people don't move from the Pyrenees to Amsterdam. Sure, they do. But as an average, the percentage of the population that's moving around across Europe is much smaller than it is across the United States, where you have, it's not uncommon, probably about 25% of Americans have their core family nuclear structure, one or two layers deep, that are spread at a minimum across one of the large regions in the United States, and if not across, the whole US. That's not sort of different. And I think that's and the reason that's important is that you have a much greater concentration effect in populations. And so when there is a populism, there tends to be built around certain economic advantages or disadvantages that those populations feel that are coming about either out of their national government or regional government, or off of some random event that happens. And I think that's very different. And the last piece of this, that tends not to be actor driven, right? I mean, you don't need an individual actor to sort of maintain those feelings and those grievances over generations. They become almost part of your fabric. And I don't think there's any state or any region within a state or that doesn't have some of those. So I think that's where there's a substantial difference, is that the cycle effects of politics don't ameliorate those in Europe as much as they do maybe in a place like the United States, or even Canada for that matter, which I think has a lot of very similar dynamics as the US, even though it's 10 times smaller in terms
Right.
of population. So anyways,
But back to the ECSC,
yep.
I think one of the key advantages, and I think Aaron would agree with me here, is that the ECSC really created the blueprint for an international trading, economic, free trade zone. It wasn't perfect, and we talked about the carve-outs and exclusions, but it led to increased productivity, it led to increased trade, and it led to a facilitation of peaceful conversation about these issues.
Yeah. And one thing that is missed because it's really nerdy is the development of standardization. The which was an imposition. I mean, let's not argue that this was just fun, right? If you were running a business, or you were a smaller cobbler, or somebody who was, a smith of some kind, you would see these standards start implemented or getting implemented across many different spheres. But over time, those standards that were built out of the coal and steel community, and in the beginning, it was just very simple standards of what a unit volume was, and then what grades of different materials were, and shipping, and this very, very basic, but that allowed for more predictable development, which was a very important phase, because you could plan on doing, and given the scale of redevelopment that had to happen, where we're talking about tens of thousands of semi destroyed or impacted towns, cities, and communities, getting some predictable standards-based resources was a big deal in the 40s and 50s. And then once it was redeveloped, expanding beyond that, which, creating the road systems. And I'd say one of the biggest things, like in the similar way the United States, you had the interstate road, basically our version of a road compact. You had one across Europe around trains. And you could not have had that without the European coal and steel community. That just would have been, it would have added a decade or longer.
No, it would have been impossible, I think,
Yeah.
because in most of the European countries, the rail gauge, which is the width
Right.
of the rail, was actually different.
Yeah.
And it's actually been a
It was
major
purposely
problem.
different too, so
Right,
that you wouldn't gain advantages in war, actually.
right. Because
Yeah.
if you invade and the rail is the same gauge, you can just send your cars all the way to the front line.
Right.
So no, it's actually a huge issue, for example, to connect local trains between, let's say, France and Spain, because the gauge is different. Or and so the standardization of European rail was a key result of things like the ECSC.
Yep, exactly.
But of course, with any positive, there are bound to be negatives. And most of these negatives are related to the protectionism and the price floors and the other things that say that even though it was the beginning of a free trade system, it was not free trade as we understand it today. And the idea was, in Schumann's view and in the view of the others who put forward the Treaty of Paris of 1951, was to set a beginning benchmark on which further cooperation could be developed. Because if you propose one gigantic system at once, nobody's going to sign on to it. But if you go incrementally, then things could be standardized and organized. And there are benefits and drawbacks to that method. But one of the drawbacks is this immediate issue that it doesn't look like what we would dream a free state, free trade society would look like.
And the other thing too, and I think this is, to this day, this is a fundamental challenge in Europe, is that the belief in the incrementalism is sort of baked into the operating model. And you could argue that's sort of their software, which I think is a very powerful tool in sort of allowing cultural change to build up behind policy change, so that populations sort of support it. The one thing that has been a consistent ding going back, 60 plus years, is there doesn't tend to be sort of a timeline. There doesn't tend to be sort of a 5, 10, 15 year, and then this sort of graduating down to that shift. So what happens is you'll get an incrementalism. And until there's another shock in the system about the incrementalism, you don't really confront the incrementalism. And that is what I would still argue is I used to think it was a bug in the approach that the EU or that pan-Europeans have. I actually think it's a feature in the system. And I think it's a real problematic one, because as you bring in more differentiated states and peoples and regions, if you don't have some of these runway timelines, I mean, you could have a policy for 55 years. And that means you're in essence subsidizing it. And my bigger thesis has been that a lot of European policy has turned into agricultural policy. And I think that the impact on that is it has locked in place advantages that certain regions have, and other regions will just never catch up because they don't have that sort of slingshot ability, because the policies just don't change. They say so incremental so long. So I think it's part of that.
I actually have a question from the
Yep.
comments. And so how do we reconcile that on the one hand, European elites were working for the creation of a European community and that kind of development, but we also had, the First and Second World War. Is that the bug you just mentioned? If I could direct quickly to the question, we're talking about two different time periods,
Yep.
right? In the post-war time period, the elites changed their tactic and decided that it would be much better if they avoided war in the future, given the threat of the Soviet Union, given the strength of the United States, the declining power of empire. There was a massive shift in the way that the European elites saw their future, and they saw that if they threw their lot in together as a peaceful continent, they might be able to resist both of those powers.
And you do bring up a very interesting component we don't talk about. I don't think very few people do, is that as their colonial possessions collapse, both because of the wars itself, World War I, World War II, and then the post-war, post-colonial liberation and independence movements, they were left in many ways, because you could make a very realistic argument that many of these states were sort of underdeveloped within themselves, because they had so much, they were driven by their colonial models, extractive models, and sort of operating models for so long, that sort of they hadn't taken care of the basics, let's just say. And so I think part of what made this period really important, especially in the 50s, was it concentrated the effort going into the 60s on internal development. And it was about, we're talking the basics here. We're talking electrification. I mean, very similar to the sort of development that went on in the United States, really in the 30s, where we, and 40s, where we sort of standardized through the Depression and World War II an enormous amount of the United States, and we sort of, developed at least a larger chunk of it, given its landmass. And a very similar process took place in the 50s and into the 60s, which I think, once again, without the ECSC, you don't have the same precedent-setting tools in place that a French company could make an investment in the Netherlands, or a West German company could make an investment in Belgium, even if it's not a sophisticated 21st century type of structure. Just being able to legally be, able to be part of an entity in another state, which up until that point was really restricted. So this changed a lot of the operating culture in elites, I think, is more important. But that's another issue, is that it became, I think, a very elite-driven project, basically.
Absolutely. We have another question in the comments saying, why do we list direct quality control as a disadvantage? And I'll take this one. Primarily, when we think of the super state entities that would come after the European coal and steel community, which is what this slide is contrasting, the idea that quality control would be done at a national level as opposed to at the level of the community was considered a disadvantage, right? Because then you would have different qualities that existed in France, existed in Germany, existed in the Benelux countries, to the extent that those countries had a coal extractive industry. And so you had different qualities of material being put on the market, and that market was supposed to be a free and open market, right? So that creates these kinds of inconsistencies and incongruencies that you don't want to have if you're creating a free market. So that's the issue with direct quality control. It's that it's not supranational.
And there's these very sort of as if you nerd out on this stuff, which Richard and I do, and just to give a very fair background here. I mean, Richard has his master's of laws and obviously his law degree too, in European law. So, he's got a qualified nerd background. I have one just because I've loved the development of these complex institutions and how they kind of collide with people the last 20, 30 years. But there are these fantastic examples around like the Italian, cement and limestone industries, right? Which, today these are, basically European businesses, right? But that was not the case 50, 60, 70 years ago. It was starting to be the case 50 years ago, but definitely not 60, 70 years ago. I mean, these were regional businesses within Italy, and they represented power within the state, right? And so their ability to manipulate their quality or their value that they produced was very different when you start to move a standard of a French, let's say a southeastern French cement company, right? So that would be near the Italian border. And they would take sort of waste inputs to sell sort of cheaper, lower quality limestone cement, making materials, creating that. It was a cultural shift, right? I mean, you're really developing a new human being who thinks of industrial development differently and business differently. That was and that was imposed on the population, and it was very top down. It is actually kind of amazing that there wasn't as much resistance. I think a lot of it had to do with how dominant media was then. And there were just a handful of outlets in every state, and the power of those leaders with their media. Because if you take today's media environment,
I don't think it would have happened.
Yeah, I mean, Region 13 getting screwed by Region 6. I mean, it just, the whole thing just goes sideways, right? So I think it's just very, very different. But anyways, let's jump to
So in
another great name. I have one of my favorite names.
The European Economic Community?
No, the EURATOM. So
So we talked about how in 1951 we founded this European Coal and Steel Community, and that became such a success that the Europeans did it again. So they met in Rome, right? Last time we met in Paris, but this time we met in Rome, and we signed on the 25th of March of 1957 two distinct treaties. The first treaty is called the Treaty of Rome, and it founded the European Community, the European Economic Community, sorry. And the second treaty that was signed was the Euratom Treaty, and these were two different treaties designed for two different functions, right? The European Economic Community had as its final goal the creation of the single market. Now, we discussed how the European Coal and Steel Community was designed to promote that kind of interaction on certain specific items, right? We talked about coal, primarily coal and steel, but also relatively related industrial goods. But the goal of the European Economic Community was really to bring down borders and barriers to trade of all kinds. Of course, there would still be those specific industries that were considered national securities that would not be addressed by this single market created by the European Economic Community. But by and large, it opened up a significant amount more of goods that could be traded, businesses that could become cross-border, and really facilitated the integration of Europe as a singular entity. Euratom was a direct result of the increasing studies, especially in France, towards the creation of atomic weaponry. And the idea of unifying both atomic use in a positive way, right, nuclear power and development, as well as preventing strikes from one European state to another European state by creating routine inspections and other kinds of developments designed with the purpose of avoiding conflict and conflagration. Now, as I said, the ECSC was signed in 1951. These were signed in 1957. Most of these organizations become active 1 or 2 years after they're signed. But in 1967, there was another treaty signed that unified all three of these entities together, sort of like a bundle of sticks. There was no top-down organization, but now they were together as one unit, and these were called the European Communities. So after 1967, these entities are functioning now as one unified set of distinct bureaucratic entities. You can think of, for an example, the way the executive branch exists in the United States, where you have numerous three-letter agencies that are all bundled together in the executive branch, even though they are all independently functioning.
Yeah, and I really do want to talk for a quick second, Richard, about how important EURATOM was to the complete development, and I would say, a world power that France is when it comes to civilian nuclear energy. I mean, the development of over 100 reactors came from the EURATOM project, and the fact that France gets at this point almost 80% of its electricity from nuclear energy is really directly linked to this. And for many other cases, other states in Western Europe, did and still do participate and still have nuclear reactors for energy. Some, like the Germans, have sort of arbitrarily shut them down 10 years ago and had to radically import an enormous amount of coal from Poland, which created all kinds of other challenges. But I do think the development, this was a kind of a cutting edge thing, really, if we're going to think about it, right? It would almost be the equivalent today of, imagine like the European Digitization Commission, right? I mean, it would just be not just sort of something buried underneath 50 others, but something that is taking cutting edge technology and trying to sort of transform Europe, or having a vision for that. So anyways, I'll pass that back to you.
No worries. We actually have a comment. Somebody who was following us on the YouTube page has messaged us here, and it's just a comment. They said that they were working in imports. They were working in the US military, and that the EU wanted the US to deal with them as a union for US exports, but imports from the European Union were on a country by country basis.
Yeah.
And so it might have changed. The person retired from the USDA in 2013. But
so it's USDA.
Yeah, USDA. No, I realized it as I was going through it sounded like military, but USDA is agriculture.
Yeah.
Somebody else is asking, when did women start to sit at these tables, noting that we have a picture of probably close to 300 people and all of them are of the masculine persuasion.
Well, and just as bad, they all clearly went to the exact same men's warehouse to buy the same suit, but that's my little joke on the side.
But no, so when did women start sitting at these tables? They would start sitting at these tables within the next decade and a half.
Exactly. And one of really the first head of a commission was female, so we'll bring her up later by the time we get into the 70s. So all right. Yes, and no one wears it well. Yes, that was pretty good. Well, and sadly, they probably all smoked themselves to death. Sorry for anyone here who smokes. I don't know what that population would be if I make fun of people who smoke. But anyways, that's my other joke. So, all right, Treaty of Rome. You want me to jump on this, or do you want to take your?
I think we can sort of go through it relatively quickly.
Yep.
Because we sort of addressed a lot of the things, right? We talked about the primary mission was to create that internal market and to create an economic community within the Union, right? That's why it's called the European Economic Community. And the way that they would do it is by removing customs laws and tariffs and try and prevent competition distortions, try and create a European Investment Bank, which is the forerunner of the European Central Bank that exists under the EU. And that was designed to try and homogenize to a certain extent the various floating currencies in the European Union, and to bring non-member countries into association with the members of the union, which is actually a very new idea. The idea that other countries could be in association with the European Economic Community, even if they couldn't be direct members. Probably the longest term non-member associate was the United Kingdom, which was kept out by Charles de Gaulle of France using his veto, which was a key aspect of this organization. But Britain, as an associate, was playing with, to a certain degree, lower tariffs than it would normally have and better economic development.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the de Gaulle UK linkage all the way to Brexit as a separate conversation, because there's a larger sort of narrative arc in that story that goes back, I'd say solidly 60 to 70 years. So,
yeah, so we have two more. One is a comment saying that he really likes our hosting of the program and that he enjoyed your Pearl Harbor talk. And then, of course, we have a question.
You mean, how does Pearl Harbor and the common agricultural policy link together? No, I'm joking.
Well, if there's 60 degrees of separation.
Exactly.
So thank you very much, Robert, for your kind words. To Carolyn's question, how does this discussion, like the Treaty of Rome, fit into the GATT treaties and WTO and wider sort of international economic policy? In terms of the WTO, by the time the WTO is formed, the European Economic Community joins it as a singular member. And in the WTO today, the European Union is represented as a single candidate. Now, the member nations can also discuss things, but in terms of the actual access to the WTO and the ability to submit claims and all these kinds of things, it's primarily routed through the European Union, which shows just how much of a customs union it has become in terms of international trade. But I'll hand it off to Aaron.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I mean, one of the things that I think is very powerful here, especially we're talking the late 50s, is attempting to drive a type of social policy, not just a pure sort of economic policy. So the abolition of sort of visa and sort of travel requirements, and attempting to drive more circulation of people, services, money, capital, and at the same time attempting to develop what became, and they labeled it this way, social cohesion, which they still use. I mean, it's something, 60, almost 65 years later. So there, but you also got, and this is, I think, where things get very real in the, oh my goodness, this is a whole career to understand this, you get this instrumentation that starts to kick into gear, right? So the administrative culture that I do think is something, a decent percentage of the population, probably at least 50%, find difficult with the concept of the EU. And I don't mean people who are, anti-EU or anti,
just general population.
Just general. I mean, and we see this because you get less than, you get somewhere between 30-ish to high 40s that vote in European elections. Or cast ballots, I should say, for candidates for European elections. And in many cases, these are the same people voting in their own election. So they're purposely not casting a ballot because I think in many cases they have no idea what this instrumentation is. And so this is 65 years ago. Like, this is like almost like crayons and for like 3-4-year-olds when you start talking about some of the more advanced directives that you have now.
I was going to say the right equivalent, I think, for many in the American audience would be trying to figure out the tax bureaucracy,
Yeah,
right?
that's
Like
exactly right.
like you're filling out your taxes. Like what are all these different exceptions? What are these different groups? Who's benefiting? It looks like an arcane and opaque set of
Right.
institutions because of how intensely bureaucratically they've been set up.
Exactly. And we'll get into that in a minute. Is so, just to allow people to understand, the Treaty of Rome was, I think, in some ways, I think it was maybe the second or third most important treaty, because it drove an enormous amount of sort of European institutionalism, right? Especially from the big states. It really said, all right, we're going to be committed to this cross-border, cross-development model, and not just economically, but socially. And then as you move forward, can you go back a slide?
Sure.
Yeah, so the 73 enlargement. So you start having, and one thing to recognize is, how do they get their budget, right? So as Europe evolved its way into creating VATs, value-added taxes, the main tools it had were basically customs duties and trade tariff taxes, et cetera. And there became this sort of arcane, of course, splitting of all of those receipts and revenues across, the members, and then especially as you integrated them into the EEC, you then had this financialization mechanism that fed the development of the underlying institutions. But it was weird. I mean, so when we say it fed the underlying institutions, there still wasn't like a building all these people went to work at. Right. It wasn't this sort of, this view in the sort of, let's say, administrative world of the last, millennium, where you'd create sort of a headquarters. So there was this very diffuse system. They would meet, regularly. Some of these people would just live in hotels. I mean, it was a very immature sort of institutional environment, which eventually got corrected. And I would sort of argue they swung the other way in Brussels, or not just Brussels, Strasbourg. There's a whole weird thing they do, which most people don't realize, in that they live, 3 out of 4 weeks in Brussels, and then 1 out of 4 weeks in Strasbourg. And then they meet in a couple other places randomly. I mean, it is kind of a little goofy. Which I think at some point is going to have to be corrected, right? I mean, that's not a sustainable way to have, sort of operating governance. But in the early 70s, this enlargement was a very important political enlargement, because it included the UK, but it also included Ireland. And so you really started to develop the idea of, well, this could be really pan-European. This wasn't just going to be this sort of a core Western European, which really means France, Germany, and a bunch of their friends, project, plus Italy. But it was going to be this project that was going to expand in Europe. Now, one thing to recognize is Spain and Portugal were purposely not included, because they were still under, pseudo autocratic dictatorships, basically. And so there was this understanding that while they were that way, they weren't going to be part of this structure. And that, of course, changed over the following decade. The last couple pieces here is that they started to develop this concept called the European Regional Development Fund. And as I said, they were not headquartered. So this was actually sort of a feature, an advantage, because the people who were representative of those committees and structures that were being developed really lived in those regions. So they could, in some ways, they were almost like, members of the House of Representatives of the EEC in those communities, living there and saying, hey, we need an X, we need a new bridge, we need a new tunnel, because, that region has 15 tunnels and we don't have one. So there was this balancing effect that was starting to go on economically using the EEC, very, very focused on infrastructure and what was called production and investment. And I think that was a critical phase to harmonizing a lot of the infrastructure. If you go across Western Europe now, that you have was really developed in the 70s and 80s. Next slide, real quick here. Oh, Richard, next slide.
Yeah, sorry.
I know you were checking out the chat.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. So do you want to do the single act, or you want me to do that?
You can do it.
Okay. So single act is what you would say is the same way as the 73 act meant for infrastructure and production. This act, you could say, created the artifice or the scaffolding of the modern concept of a European sort of federalism. So this was about we will create a truly internal market. We will eliminate the obstacles for the free circulation of goods, people, services, capital. There will be, which really means financial and technical norms, right? I mean, this isn't just, hey, you can buy a chair over in this market and it'll, use a similar tool and die. It will be whatever extra, sort of local tariffs were put on buying chairs in a different region are going to be eliminated, and some imposition of technical requirements around, quality control, down to a very, very hyper local level. And then there would be this new concept of implementing a standard monetary policy, or at least the building of monetary capacity so you can build a monetary policy, putting a lot more energy in the social policy, economic and social cohesion, putting the environment really for the first time on their agenda. And this is also the sort of like like if you study anything about the history of the world, kind of like the Cambrian species explosion of committees, right? Today, there's over 300 plus committees, at least. No one really has a good number.
No one knows how to count them.
Yeah, they just don't know how to count them really at this point, like to the point that they don't even publish, like people just throw their hands up. There's almost a little joking kind of blogs out there, guessing. This is going from these, let's say they had dozens of committees, maybe 50 going into 86, and you go well over 100, 150 after this. The next slide real quick. So some more pieces here. This is where they start creating, if you follow anything about Europe the last 20 years that have become popular, things called structural funds. So think of this as the way in a normal parliamentary or legislative system that you would create the equivalent of sort of a budgeted item. Think of these structural funds as sort of that budgeted item. So if there's going to be a new structural fund for upgrading rail cars over X period of time so that they, are less environmentally impactful or more efficient, whatever, then there'll be a structural fund that's associated with that. So you're getting this very instrumented, almost legislative structure. And then the reform of all the structural funds so that they map to all these cohesions, the social cohesion. And then it goes down this whole set of sort of priorities. The next, and as you can see, there's Article 130 already. So we're up to hundreds of articles. So there's an explosion. And behind these articles, I mean, you have to realize there's just like a tree trunk of roots of sub-articles and directives and regulations, many cases, hundreds or thousands under each one. The next slide.
This is sort of a me slide. So one of the things that I just want to sort of sum up, so we sort of remember where we are, that there are sort of three things that are happening that we should keep our mind on, right? The first one is that we've been integrating Europe together, and that there's this change in the way that elites in Europe perceive what the future of Europe is, that the aftermath of, even though the United States of Europe idea was an old idea, it was never the dominant idea. But now in the wake of World War I and World War II, where there's so much destruction in Europe, you have the forces external to Europe. There's an increasing drive for Europeans to move beyond these historic animosities and try and create some sort of shared economic and social structure. And so the next thing that we should keep our eye on is the three ways that until the 1960s that they tried to do this, which was the formation of those three entities that became part of the European communities. That is the ECSC, the EURATOM, and the EEC. And finally, that there's a shift in the late 50s, early 60s, where we talk about this accession of more states, that the goal of these entities would not be to strictly stay with the 6 states that started, but that it would expand to additional states like the United Kingdom, which was integrated in 1973, like Greece, that was integrated, I believe, in 81. You have this goal that eventually more democratic states in Europe should be part of these institutions. And at the same time, as you have this widening, as more states are brought in, you also have what's called a deepening, where the institutions themselves become more complex, have more capacities, and have more time devoted to achieving those capacities, right? So more and more, we're moving from an international structure with some supranational components to a primarily supranational architecture with only very few international components. So one of these deepening relationships is the Schengen Agreement, which is signed in 1985, followed by the Schengen Convention of 1990, which is actually the more binding one. But it only comes into effect in 1995. And the Schengen Agreement, it deals with a number of different things. It was signed on a boat as it was passing the city of Schengen, so that's how it got its name. But the Schengen Agreement is about security and foreign policy of the European Union. At this time, of course, it was the European communities, but of the European communities. And the security that we're talking about is borders, customs, police conversations between countries, uniform legal administration, extradition, all of these kinds of enforcement maneuvers within the European communities, and enforcement maneuvers when it came to external parties to the European communities. Now, one of the things that's very noticeable immediately is that the borders of Schengen do not necessarily overlap with the borders of the European communities at the time that they're given, and they don't necessarily apply exclusively to the European Union at all, and that there are members of the European communities and later European Union that were never part of Schengen, right? So we have this disjointed relationship, right? We have countries like Norway and Iceland, which have never become part of the European communities or part of the European Union, that are part of the Schengen Agreement, that have this shared borders, police connectivity arrangement. And then we have countries like the United Kingdom and Ireland, which were members from 1973 together until 2020, and Ireland is still a member today, that were never members of the Schengen Agreement, having their own common area agreement because of the Northern Irish troubles, which we're not going to get into here. Now, that's its own series.
That will be that will take our wrong gauged rail system off the tracks.
Yeah, but one of the things I want, like, if you look at the picture in the upper left hand side, you can see this is a border between Spain and Portugal. Those cars are actually in a different country than the street sign. So that should show you under Schengen what happened to all of those borders. Now, it meant, of course, that you can see that there's no border control at all anymore. You just drive right through, as the same way that you would in the United States, between constituent states in the country, which was a huge fundamental shift. And it really helped facilitate the economic and social growth of a European unity that we've been talking about before, with the ECSC, with the EEC, and with with Euratom to a lesser degree. And yeah, so this is a key element in the
And I
unification of
think
Europe.
something that's really important to understand is how people interpret this, because as Richard properly points out, it's that this is a much larger agreement than what most people. I mean, when people are polled in Europe and really anywhere else, but especially in Europe, they literally just believe this is the 90 days, and if you're not a citizen of the EU or a citizen of a state of the EU, that you can stay in a country in the EU and you have to leave. I mean, there is if you could define bad messaging, you would put, after 30, 40 years or 30 plus years, this right up there in terms of people's understanding. I mean, they never really messaged the implications of what this is, because most people just don't understand what this agreement is. A lot of lawyers don't really understand what, if they don't have to work with it. And to this day, there's something to understand is this this coexistence that Richard was bringing up earlier. So you have 5 EU members that are not part of the area: Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Romania, but they're legally obliged at some point in the future to join. Ireland maintains its opt-out, and it has its own visa policy. And then there's 4 European Free Trade Association member states: Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland, that are not members of the EU, but have signed the agreements in the association with the Schengen Agreement and Accord. And there's also 3 microstates: Monaco, San Marino, and Vatican City, that maintain open borders for passengers. And so, so I think it's very important when you start to get to this hyper local, down to the people level, where the institutional structure is so pliable and in some ways feels nebulous. And I think this is where the power of many of the things that the EU has done in the last 30 to 50 years comes in. But I'd also say this is where the disconnect comes in also, in what people understand what the EU is. And it's sort of, they live in almost a strange duality there.
One of the funny things, and I wanted to sort of focus on this because you mentioned EFTA. If you look at the border between Norway and Sweden, you have this sort of weird situation, because Norway, Sweden, and the other Nordic countries are part of a Nordic association that allows for the free movement of people. But since Norway never became a member of the European Union and stayed in EFTA, while Sweden became part of the European Union, the people can freely move between Norway and Sweden, but the goods cannot.
That's right.
So you actually have to go to border stations to have your goods examined, but you as a person are not.
And I sort of live this a little bit, because I think you might know, Richard, some of you might know that pre-COVID and hopefully post-COVID, if there's ever post-COVID, I try to spend at least a month in Scandinavia in the summer and just basically work from there. And, which is really, I've gone really throughout all the states: Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, but especially Denmark and Norway and Sweden, especially the western coast, Gothenburg and Malmo on the Swedish side, and Oslo and basically all of Denmark. And there's this game people play about what they bring. This sort of weird shopping game, which is just strange, really. There's almost a little version of that now. It sort of went away between the U.S. and Canada, but it's very similar. Right? It's basically a nuisance, is what it is. I mean, I'm sort of convinced all it does is it keeps people involved in this employed, because that's about all it could do. Because, people literally, because they don't want to because if you go through some of these lines with nothing, you fly right through. And if you have stuff, which could be, you screwed up and left milk and beer or whatever in one of your coolers, then it's just, you're being taken apart for an extra half hour and it's a waste of time. So there's this it's a very strange dynamic. And I have friends, which thank goodness you don't have to have that problem anymore with digital music, that they had this problem with CDs and DVDs back in the day. where people would bring their receipts to prove where they bought the DVDs and their CDs. I mean, it was just sort of absurd. But anyway, so I think that sort of speaks to some of this, so some of these dynamics.
Right. So when we get to 1992, we have this Treaty of Maastricht, which really brings together, right, all of these different pillars of the European Union together into what we now call the European Union, right? So we have this massive signing that leads to three aspects. That lead to these aspects of the European Union that before were separated, right? The common foreign and security policy, that's something related to Schengen, but not exclusively Schengen. The economic and monetary union, which we saw with the European communities. And then we also have a closer cooperation on justice and home affairs, which is also somewhat related to Schengen, although not exactly. And the European Union begins to crystallize the ways in which that expansion, because we talked about that widening, right? The expansion of the European Union, how that expansion would occur. And those are called the Copenhagen criteria. And there are quite a number of them, but they really boil down to making sure that any country that enters the European Union would be a democratic nation with the rule of law that respects human rights and protects minorities, that it has a market economy and can work within the market, the common markets of the European Union, because otherwise how can it join a common market? And it will join the aims of this further deepening of the European institutions, right? They'll become more complex, more supranational, and more organized, and that they're committed to that mission as opposed to wanting to be more nationalist or or more independent minded. And so the European Union will evaluate candidates that will come in to see whether or not they fall into those paradigms based on an examination of their current economy and the willingness of their politicians. I have a question of how are the erosions of the Copenhagen criteria monitored or structurally acted upon, if at all? Acted upon is hard. There is definitely a lot of critique, for example, of Hungary, which has violated some of these norms, especially when it comes to rule of law and respect for minorities. And so there are acts of censure, but we have never seen a country kicked out of the European Union, and it's doubtful that a country like Hungary, with its strategic position, would be, regardless of these violations. But they certainly are monitored by the European Union, primarily by the Commission, if memory serves.
Yeah, and I also we won't talk about it today because it'll fit the larger conversation when we have it between, from de Gaulle and basically anti UK policy all the way through Brexit. But the Treaty of Maastricht, I think, was an extremely important moment in the development of, what you would say is a combination of anti-European policy coming or being developed in the UK, and then also the same on the continent in Europe, especially out of the Germans and the French. And so you really, I think all sides lost a very important period in the development of the exchange rate mechanism and the Treaty of Maastricht to reconcile. And one of my arguments long term is that the UK was never truly a wanted member in the continental European project. It was always sort of a pushed. Right. It was never pulled. And we'll talk about that later. But I think the Treaty of I've always felt like the die was cast. And I remember this back then. I was starting to nerd out on sort of economics a little bit back then. And I just started recognizing like, wow, this is a big deal, this sort of consolidation of financial power in Europe, and then also building these functioning markets, and then having this sort of parallel track, a relationship with the UK. I just felt like, wow, I don't know how long this. I was actually surprised it lasted another, almost 30 years, right? So I think that's something that will come.
One other point that the Treaty of Maastricht also recognized the reunification of Germany, right?
Yes.
Because previously in the European communities, it had always been West Germany as a member.
Right.
The accession of East Germany through membership of West Germany was controversial at the time, given that East Germany didn't have a lot of these Copenhagen criteria, and Western Germany would have to slowly implement them.
And there was a very important deal in that the French, of course, drove, because their fear was obviously a new super Germany, which was basically the elimination of the Deutschmark. So the deal was, you could argue, this was the primordial ooze of the development of the European currency unit. Basically, was the unification of Germany and Maastricht, coinciding with the French support, because basically, I truly believe the French thought that their positioning, or that Paris's position as a financial power was going to be greater, because the Germans were going to spend so much more energy in their unification project. So I think that was a lot of the calculus that went into that.
Absolutely.
And the French, I think, were sort of probably shocked at how, I wouldn't have been, but how efficient the Germans were at their reunification project and their investment. They were basically done by the year 2000, 2001.
So this is a visualization of some of the stuff we've been talking about. So you can see, if you look at the upper left-hand side, moving towards the right, how as time goes on, we integrate more and more of these agencies, and that by the time we get to the Treaty of Maastricht, which is on the right-hand side, you have that European Union sort of subsuming the European community, the ECSC, some of the other alliances and foreign policy commitments, and police and judicial commitments, international police and judicial commitments, together within the European Union set of competences when the Treaty of Maastricht happens. So there's a lot of things that are sort of being collapsed into one entity at this point, even though they are under this umbrella together, they are still under this umbrella as distinct pieces under the umbrella, which is why the colors remain distinct, even though they're within that blue box at this point. When we move to the Treaty of Lisbon, that's where that dark blue is. But I just wanted to sort of give a visual representation of this deepening set of competencies that are taken as we move forward in time.
Yeah, and recognize none of these, and this has always been a debate, I would say, the last 30 years. And it was really heightened in the 2000s when we get to this, but that there was not a constitution, that there was a very strong group of legalists, really, that really said, look, this is, however we got here makes sense. There was the Western European, the Cold War, et cetera. But since we're now in this practically open space of Europe, we need to get a lot more, legally constitutional, and that sort of fed this dynamic, which we'll definitely get into coming up, I think, in the next slide or two.
Yeah, this is Maastricht. This is more Maastricht. The next kind of integration that we saw was the introduction of the euro, and so the introduction of the euro was first formulated in 1999 when it became a currency of an account. And what a currency of account is that the value of other currencies can be measured by it. So what ends up happening is that you have the currencies of you had all the currencies of Europe slowly being pegged to the euro in order to create stable exchange rates. And then in 2002, those currencies were removed from circulation and euros were given to those people at whatever that fixed exchange rate had been from 1999 onwards. So there were some cases like Germany, it was almost 2 marks to the euro. In France, it was almost 7 francs to the euro. In Spain, it was something like 120 pesetas to the euro. The rate was different in every country, but those rates were fixed and people knew about them. And their savings in terms of the banks was just flipped. It was just a decimal conversion. If in terms of the currency they had to bring in their old bills and get new ones. But this created a massive boon to the economic unification of Europe, because suddenly we're not dealing with currencies and exchange rates. Everything costs the same amount in different places in the European Union, in the sense that 5 euros is 5 euros is 5 euros. It did lead to a bit of inflation in many of the European states when the conversion occurred. But in the long term, it has facilitated one of the largest economic growths in the European Union's history, even if we bring it back all the way to 1951 with the ECSC.
Yeah, there was, and we can get into this in the future episode if we even add on to the 4 we've committed to, is that there was a bug in the system that they created, which is they did not there were 2, right? So they did not have a path for financial integration in the banking system, which has absolutely contributed to some real challenges they've had in Europe the last dozen years. And then I would say just as important is that there was not the development or the maturity of a Eurobond market, which meant issuing debt. And of course, that was primarily blocked by the Germans, but over time, the Dutch and other Northern Europeans who basically did not trust the institutional structure to protect those debt instruments from the rest of Europe. And I believe really fundamentally that has been a substantial design flaw in the financial development of Europe and especially giving it shock absorbers in crises. I think that's really, and we'll see that going forward.
One of the things is I wanted to sort of explain what you're seeing when you're looking at that map. The first one is that those areas that are in blue are areas that have adopted the euro. The areas in light green are those that have permission to print their own euros, but are not treaties parties to the agreement, and that's why because they're city-states, basically. The ones in yellow are those that are obliged by treaty to bring on the euro. Those that are pink or green are in different stages of negotiation over the implementation of the euro. Denmark still has an opt-out. And what's the most interesting to me is if you look, Montenegro and Kosovo are in dark purple, meaning that they have the right to use the euro without explicit permission from the European Central Bank, and have primarily used it to stabilize their economies. But they don't print any euros. They only use euros that have been brought there from other countries.
It's called the Argentine effect, basically, which is the dollarization. The same thing happened or has occurred in Argentina over the last 50 to 75 years, where you get a dollarization. So very similar. You could say there's sort of a de facto Euroization going on in a lot of the Balkans, which I think it's provided sort of a liquidity and almost a lubricant to become European, at least economically. But they have to want to catch up from an institutional perspective, obviously.
So the next thing is that in 2004, you had a mass expansion of the European Union. And I realized that we're getting very close to the witching hour. So I think actually this might be a good place for us to stop and really address European expansion, Treaty of Lisbon, and other developments in that history in our institutional discussion.
Yep.
That will be coming up soon. We don't have a fixed date yet, I don't believe. But if you liked what we presented today, please do come again. And if you have any closing remarks, Aaron, or open it up to more questions.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I would, and I really appreciate it, and appreciate everyone's time on a Sunday, especially some of you that are not in the U.S. or so it's late. If any of you have comments, I mean, did you like our sort of approach? We tried to make this not as academic as it can easily become. We're trying to sort of pull out all of this so that it's a little more living. So that as we eventually get into these headier kind of discussions and politics and kind of the power of the EU going forward, or lack of it, or both, there's some background so we understand why the decisions are made and what those histories are. That's really our context in this. So any of you that have comments, different directions or different ideas that you'd like to see, please feel free to comment. We really appreciate the time. Great job, Richard, and
Great job, Aaron.
Thank you. And anybody else? Any other comments or anything? I don't know. Is Zach actually there? I don't know.
I think he fell asleep.
Yes.
But
and by the way, if any of you seek a sleeping aid, you have the YouTube video that you could just sort of put on the background and take and then you can just listen to us talk about the.
We have several comments giving us their thanks and appreciation. Yep. One is asking if you could give the link to the 4-minute YouTube video.
Oh yeah, sure, I will do that.
So yeah, let's put that in the comments. And we just got somebody coming in from the waiting room. So yeah, I'm sorry that you missed a little bit. But yeah, so
yeah, this is a whole like 40 minutes discussion, but from minute 2 to like minute 5, 6, they talk about the 11 kind of wise founding fathers, which is really nice, and the woman that does it does a very quick and great job. So I think obviously that fits some kind of the generic great man theory concepts, Carlyle, et cetera. I do think it's apropos in this case, right? Because these 11, without their commitment, I don't see how any of this gets started, right? It just it's impossible.
We have a comment on the Polish plumber, and he's supposed to be sexualized, so that comment is very apropos. No, one of the things, and of course we're going to discuss it more in depth next time, is that a lot of the populist view that this eastward expansion of 2004 should not take place is that the free movement of people would result in that many people from the poor Eastern European states would come to the Western European states and compete in those economies. And so one of the most common motifs was that there was going to be a Polish plumber that would come to France, and all the French plumbers would lose their jobs because the Polish plumber would work for less money. Where have we heard this argument before? So
and there was one other interesting motif too, which I think proved pretty accurate actually, which was from the people who were driven by the economic development side of the house in those countries. They felt that that their top talent was going to leave, and of course a lot of it did, and that would adversely impact, which it has. I mean, you look at places like Romania and Bulgaria, I would argue a huge,
they have massive brain drain.
Yeah, the brain drain is. I mean, you're probably looking at safely 75% of the top tier talent out of those countries has left, or at least leaves regularly, and that has a generational impact. So there was, and I'm not arguing that you shouldn't have had these expansions. It's just the fact that I think we are all, or people who are rational enough to recognize that these impacts are real, and that you have to have mitigation. And I think that's one of the pieces that in the end we can talk about when we get into the hundreds of institutional layers. is that there is not a lot of mitigation, right? I mean, there's a lot of sort of talk about how there could be a mitigation, and there's committees for the talk about mitigation, but when you get to hard mitigation, it's pretty limited. And so I think that's a very important component to really think about long term, is how does South, Eastern and Eastern Europe harmonize with Western Europe. You see a lot more harmonization with Central Eastern Europe, like the Czech Republic, and there's starting to be some in Slovakia. But and I think the Czech Republic has some advantages that aren't quite normal on average. But you find that harmonization issue is very real in people's lives. Anyway.
And just to finish on the Polish plumber, so the Polish, this is actually from the Polish tourism industry, and they decided to use the Polish plumber as a motif in their ads in France. So they made it a very attractive plumber, which is the whole sexualization thing. And je reste en Pologne, ben nombreux, meaning I remain in Poland. Many of you should come, right? Like to see me. So. I think it's a little tongue in cheek, and it's probably the best representation of I don't know,
good Polish humor
that I could find. Yeah,
and good Polish humor, actually, which we won't. As someone who's what am I, 25%? I guess I'm 25% Polish. So there's definitely a Dave Chappelle Polish humor industry, which we won't focus on this presentation, but. I really appreciate everybody here, and please, as we build out the meetup around this set of presentations, and if there's ones that you'd like to see us expand into, please leave your comments, and I really appreciate your time, and we all do. So hopefully this was a great engagement for you. Great opportunity.
All right. This is me signing off. So
thank you, everybody.
Have a nice night, guys.
Everyone have a great night.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Somebody asked about UN and somebody asked about UN agencies and IAEA. We're not planning to cover the United Nations. We're sticking within Europe.
Yeah, exactly. And then and actually, if you want, you can take, you want to do the global unmute? And then if anyone's there, we can just, if they want to talk, I don't care at this point. Do you have the global unmute or no? Yes, no.
There is there a global unmute?
Yeah, there should be.
There we go.
There you go. All right. So anyone who wants to unmute can unmute. Yeah, I mean, it's I just think there's a lot of well, obviously as we know, the EU has enormous opacity and sort of confusion and layers, and so part of what we're trying to do is unravel some of this, so that when you read an article, and I find that under normal news, even obviously good news sources, Deutsche Welle, France 24, whatever. I mean, they do. I'm not saying they do a terrible job, but they throw around the institutional layers like any normal person is going to know. Oh, well, the Council of Audit just approved the Commission of finance, and I mean, it just nobody. I mean, even people working there don't know half of these organizations. So part of what we're trying to do is give people this sense of that you can figure these things out when you're interested in them. Because I do think if you have an interest in the evolution of Europe, these institutions are, I mean, this is it. I mean, this is what they are. And you're going to see the next 30, 40 years. I mean, my argument is there's going to be a greater federalization. I think there's almost an inevitability to it at some point. Yeah.
Carolyn asked if we're going to cover the SPS, sanitary phytosanitary. We definitely plan to cover sanitary phytosanitary within the context of the European Union. There's definitely sanitary phytosanitary within the context of WTO and the United Nations, WTO more than the United Nations, but that we're not going to cover.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I'd like to know is that how much people want us to spend. I mean, you don't have a choice on the institutions because that's sort of the joke, right?
They
Like
are.
there they are. You're going to get that. Sorry, but in the direction around either social development or economic development, or let's say the newer policies, which are the more crisis-driven policies, whether it's environmental, immigration, migration, financial, et cetera. Or you could say even Russia, China, kind of international foreign policy. I think that's the new crisis area that will be developed this decade, is that there's going to be a lot more pressure on the EU to have a truly foreign policy and eventually a military policy or national security policy developed. And I think that's going to be a big, that's going to be probably the big one. If there's going to be real lines set in the ground over time in terms of places they will or won't go, I think it'll be around those areas. Because at the end of the day, if you're talking about, building naval ships, jets, missile defense, things that it's not buying grapes and blueberries, right? These are, decades long commitments and require, a huge retooling institutionally across, all of Europe. At that point, it's the United States of Europe, if that's what you really do. And my argument is and we'll talk about this when we get into the next presentation on basically how the constitutionalism sort of crashed. And I always felt that was a mistake, that they didn't just fight through it, that they sort of punted and ran from it, because I don't think you can run from building the constitutional legitimacy project. Because I think that's the heart of the issue that 90% of people have, is they don't understand how this thing works, because they don't see the connection and the legitimacy of it constitutionally with their own states. And I think that's really, they're not going to be able to run from that in the next 20 to 40 years. I think that's going to be the big, the big set of moments in European history. And I actually think they'll get through those, actually. And they'll just prove that they could have done that 30 years earlier. Yeah. Any other questions? And it's great that we have some people at midnight or 11 o'clock.
Yeah, no, and I think it's amazing that we've got people like, for example, Carolyn, who has such in-depth experience with European Union agricultural laws and stuff.
Yeah.
And
by the way,
phytosanitary.
Yeah, and by the way, Caroline, not that we're going to impose this on you, because obviously you worked a great career and retired from it. You might not have any desire to talk about this, but if there is something you really want to go into based on your experiences, because things like agricultural policy is, it's the real world, right? And it's one of the things that I've always felt is why we wanted to have this conversation, is that it's very easy to talk about something like Europe in this flying airports to airports, paying euros for coffee, going to museums. This very almost commercial, retail, travel, feel good. And then this has to, get itself into the bedrock of institutionally, and where it hits, where the money hits the road is things like agriculture.
I would go even farther. You and I have had private conversations about this, Aaron, which is that the distinction between this sort of elite surface level Europe of the way the white collar world interacts with these treaties, and the way the blue collar world and the salt of the earth, for want of a better term, interact with these treaties, is a very different reality, because of the way that these things come down as almost these gargantuan, inflexible themes coming from above, where
they're really fiats. They really are, in a strange way, almost like religious and or super state, Holy Roman Empire type fiats, from 500 to 1,000 years ago. And I think that is a really fundamental challenge, and you see it all over the world with this sort of elites to the quote unquote regular people. I think it's exacerbated in a place like Europe, because if you have a light, meaning like light bulb manufacturing plant in Romania, and you're now going to be held to the same standards as one in, right outside of Munich. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know how that's just, that's sort of it's a very dangerous fantasy, because you're almost guaranteeing, you're sowing, future anti-EU kind of, development. And I believe there's a substantial challenge in the EU and its institutions, very Western orientation, meaning Western European orientation, that they have to get out in the field. I think it's just very, in the United States, we would call this flyover country, whatever. I think that's kind of cheesy now, but there's a version of this that isn't sort of that contiguous, right? It's in every state. And I think there's a very substantive gap there. And I actually think it's very dangerous versus other parts of the world, because traditional nationalism is sort of baked into the cake. It's baked into European football. It's everywhere, right? And so the EU is sort of this other project to try to not have those behaviors and the way you want to think of something. And I think if all they're doing is putting a Holy Roman Empire kind of fiat, non-religious fiat down, I think, and where you're seeing this exacerbated very, very fast is in places like Italy. You really have a two-track Italy right now. You have a pro-EU northern part of Italy, and then you have let's say a semi-compliant EU, which, how are you going to enforce its non-compliance? The EU doesn't have an auditor army it can send into southern Italy and check, 50, 100,000 different entities. And so you really have those kind of dynamics in place. I think places like France have an advantage. They have a disadvantage because of it, but they're extremely centralized as a state. And that's obviously comes out of the Napoleonic era and its development. But other places that are more diffuse, I think they're very challenged. I think places like Poland have that same challenge. When you get to very rural Poland, it's basically, up developed Ukraine is what it is at that point. And so anyways, I think that's a lot of what we're looking forward to is going down the line with a lot of these discussions. So any of you that want to add to it? And
Aaron,
yeah.
This is Zach. Apologies for mostly listening, but this was an excellent presentation. I just have one question, and this is mostly historical. Maybe this doesn't make any sense. After what's his name? Napoleon was sent to the island, right? Obviously,
Yeah.
as a forward to the island. He said that there was no Europe before him. How true is that?
Interesting. So one person that I didn't have, because there's so many people that, had a belief or a statement of wanting to have a sort of a states of Europe. Napoleon was one of them too. Obviously, it was going to be a very French dominated one, very much like you could say the Germans are today. That it was sort of a Napoleon seeing it that way. But it had more of that kind of college of Europe. Instead of cardinals, instead of a religious order, it would have been, states. And by the way, another one that most people have no idea about is during World War II, in 42, 43, the Germans even wanted to develop basically a European Union that was obviously going to have them, in the center of it, and all of their compliant states, which were, quite a few in continental Europe at that point. So that was something that was even out there. So, there's this is an idea that has really been floating for, centuries philosophically. And I do think it's one of the reasons the elites are bought in, is that there's not a lot of convincing philosophically, because if you have been intellectually engaged and you grew up in Europe, and you went to universities and great schools and talked and thought and kind of coffee shopped your way, this is sort of a logical conclusion to the concept of what Europe is, almost like in that Roman exceptionalism way. And that's why I think, people are bought in completely at that level. I think their challenge is, as you move down generationally, and as you move into, let's say, trades and people who are more parochial, more regional, I think that's where it gets, more challenging, obviously. Any other questions? Anybody? Anyone can
No,
go
I
off.
think we're good.
Right. And we did not destroy you with the institutions and the background, which is we felt that was like a 30% chance that you might run from this because it is like counting paint cans in a certain level. But hopefully you guys are going to be interested in going out there and just reading stuff. By the way, Wikipedia, which I like for a lot of things, is fantastic. I mean, the amount of information, and then also the European, the EU itself, or the sort of confederation of supporting NGOs for the EU.
Wait. There's actually a functional question, Zach. How are we going to send the information for the next session to everybody who's been here?
You there, Zach? He's probably, oh, there he is. Nope.
No?
I mean, my understanding is everybody that attended this obviously had to accept, and we'll make sure that all of them are, all of you are part of that invite. And then obviously we'll create a track for our different presentations. And what I'd like to do is maybe we can talk about this, Richard, because there's a lot of material. Maybe we could create a little G drive or something out there that people, when we have documents or we have information that they can have our presentations, whatever.
Absolutely, we could do something like that. In terms of what our expectations are, and I mean, Aaron, you might feel differently, but I felt like we could do this once a month.
I think that's very realistic. And then I think that's absolutely realistic.
Yeah. So the next one you should expect from us is sometime in the middle of January, right?
Yeah.
Like around maybe Martin Luther King weekend, maybe the week before, maybe the week after. We'll keep everybody in the loop, but it should be around then.
Yep, absolutely. And any of you that want to, contribute, those of you especially that are Europhiles or you're living in Europe, or you have, we're more than open for that. So, we're definitely excited to do this for everybody. So enjoy the rest of your evening, or get some sleep if you're in Europe right now, or if you're a night owl, I guess go out for a drink or whatever you do. And so
anyway,
so,
let's see you guys.
Yep. See ya.
All right.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yep. Cheers. Bye-bye.